For more than a century, the identity of Jack the Ripper has haunted historians, baffled detectives, and fueled endless theories. 5 women butchered in the shadows of Victorian London, and not a single arrest until now. A breakthrough using modern forensic technology has produced the first undeniable genetic match ever linked to the killer. And it didn't come from a crime lab built for television. It came from a deteriorating piece of silk ignored for decades. What this discovery proves, and the dark truth about why authorities allowed this man to walk free, rewrites everything we thought we knew. Subscribe for more chilling historical revelations and prepare for the final chapter of a nightmare London tried to bury. London in 1888 was not the romantic postcard image people imagine today. It was a pressure cooker of poverty, disease, and desperation. In the East End, entire families were packed into single rooms. Streets overflowed with garbage, drunken shouting, and the cold hiss of fog sliding between brick walls. Among the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, darkness wasn't a lack of light. Darkness was a living thing. Shadows clung to corners like spiderwebs, and footsteps vanished into the maze of cramped passageways. It was here, in the heart of hopelessness, that a predator found a playground. The first victim was discovered on a cool morning, throat slashed so deeply it silenced even the hardened constable. Newspapers seized the moment. Headlines warned of a nameless butcher haunting the poor. Panic spread faster than logic. Women hurried home before sunset, and husbands walked their wives to the door. As nights passed, more bodies appeared. Each scene was more violent, more deliberate, almost ritualistic. Word spread in pubs and lodging houses that the killer wasn't just ending lives, he was experimenting. Police presence grew, whistles echoing down cobblestone roads, yet fear swelled larger than any patrol. Investigators lacked the tools we now take for granted. There were no fingerprints, no DNA analysis, no systematic crime scene preservation. Crowds trampled clues before authorities even arrived. By the third slaying, London realized something horrifying. This killer wasn't going to stop. People whispered prayers, glanced over shoulders, and avoided doorways where shadows pooled. Through it all, one truth hovered beneath every breath. Somewhere within this labyrinth, a man watched quietly, learning, growing bolder with every heartbeat the city offered him. As decades passed, the terror of Whitechapel transformed into legend. Authors romanticized the killer, movies embellished details, and conspiracy theories multiplied like ghosts. Evidence from the actual era faded into dusty drawers, locked archives, and lost property rooms. One peculiar item drifted through time like a cursed heirloom, a silk shawl, darkened by stains that seemed older than memory itself. The fabric was long rumored to have been found beside the body of victim Catherine Eddowes. Most dismissed it as folklore. Museums wouldn't display it. Collectors whispered about it the way sailors speak of haunted ships, rare, dangerous, and disappointing if proven fake. For years, it passed through private hands until 2007, when a man named Russell Edwards purchased it with the obsession of someone unwilling to accept dead ends. He didn't want symbolic scraps. He wanted a weapon against uncertainty. Technology had marched onward. DNA analysis, mitochondrial tracing, contamination profiling, none of this existed in the Victorian era. Suddenly, this relic was no longer historical clutter. It was a dormant witness. Edwards sought help from Dr. Jari Louhelainen, a scientist renowned for recovering genetic material from degraded remains. He warned the process would be painstaking. Over 137 years, countless fingers had touched the shawl, dragging skin cells and sweat into its fibers. But as microscopes probed deeper, something startling emerged: preserved mitochondrial DNA. This genetic signature, passed through maternal lines, survives where other markers die. It becomes a chain connecting daughters to grandmothers across centuries. Their first goal was not solving the case, but authenticating the item. When they located a living descendant of Eddowes' sister, tests revealed a perfect maternal match. The artifact was real. Those dark, rust-colored stains belonged to a victim whose final breath echoed through London. But the shawl told another story. Embedded within it was a second genetic presence, male, foreign, and impossible to dismiss. The discovery didn't answer the mystery. It fractured it wider, pulling new questions from shadows older than memory. Once the shawl's authenticity was confirmed, the investigation shifted from curiosity to precision. Dr. Lou Halanen and his team narrowed their focus to the second genetic signature woven into the threads, a sample darker and more unsettling than the victim's blood. While most DNA decays rapidly, small protected particles can cling to fabric for centuries if shielded from moisture and sunlight. It was here, beneath microscopic layers of silk, that researchers uncovered something chilling: biological evidence indicative of reproductive cells. This wasn't just contact or environmental contamination. It was intimate, violent, personal, and it placed the killer at the scene beyond argument. The scientists then turned their attention to maternal DNA databases, meticulously tracking female line descendants of historical suspects. Most suspects had no surviving maternal lines, but one did. Her genetic profile matched the sample embedded in the fabric. That descendant's lineage pointed to a single man living in Whitechapel during the murders, a Polish immigrant named Aaron Kosminski. Suddenly, fragments that once seemed unrelated began slotting together like rusted gears finally aligning. Police records from the era described Kosminski as mentally unwell, prone to paranoid hallucinations, and often violent toward women. Witnesses reported fits of rage, whispered arguments with unseen voices, and erratic behavior during late-night walks. When detectives charted the killings on a map, Kosminski's residence sat ominously at the center. His work as a barber placed sharp instruments in his hands daily. The trajectory of each crime pointed inward, as if the killer hunted his way home. Shockingly, Victorian police had suspected him from the beginning. Internal memos, preserved in margins and archives, named him directly, but without modern evidence, law enforcement could only watch. In 1891, his family committed him to an asylum. His world shrank to padded walls, locked doors, and fading screams. And as if extinguished at the source, the murders ended abruptly. Newspapers never connected the silence, but time did. And now, the shawl's fibers whispered the truth no witness could ever speak aloud. If modern DNA tied Aaron Kosminski to the crime scene, then history had already whispered his name long before microscopes ever did. As the murders unfolded in 1888, Scotland Yard quietly compiled lists of suspicious individuals. The public saw confusion and chaos, but behind closed doors, detectives debated one suspect repeatedly. At the top of their internal documents was a foreign-born hairdresser living in the heart of Whitechapel who displayed violent impulses and disturbed behavior. His proximity to the crime locations wasn't coincidence. His residence sat like a spider at the center of a deadly web. One of the most compelling historical voices belonged to Chief Constable Melville McNacton. In an 1894 memorandum, he named a man whose homicidal tendencies made him the strongest suspect. He didn't shout this opinion publicly. He wrote it carefully, privately, as if protecting someone or being watched. Years later, another figure added an even more revealing clue. Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the investigator who oversaw the case, received a personal copy of his superior's memoir. In that margin, he scribbled notes casually, almost absent-mindedly. There, in faded ink next to the chapter on the Ripper, Swanson wrote that the killer was Kosminski and that this suspect had been placed into an asylum shortly after the final murder. To future generations, this annotation became a bombshell. It wasn't rumor, it wasn't theory. It was the quiet testimony of the man who managed the investigation day after day. Yet Victorian law demanded firm evidence. Eyewitness accounts were contradictory. Without fingerprints, without DNA, the police walked a thin line between suspicion and arrest. Kosminski's family eventually intervened, committing him for erratic behavior and auditory hallucinations. His confinement aligned perfectly with the sudden, permanent halt to the murders. And yet, authorities never publicly confirmed him. Was it fear of community backlash in a divided London? Was it political pressure? Or did someone higher believe the truth truth was too dangerous to expose. The margins of old books, the whispers of old officers, these silent voices weighed heavier than any headline. They painted a portrait not of mystery, but of bureaucratic hesitation. Because sometimes the deadliest secrets aren't hidden by darkness, they're hidden by paperwork. To understand how Jack the Ripper operated with such terrifying efficiency, one must first grasp the world he hunted in. Victorian London's East End was not simply poor, it was collapsing under the weight of human misery. In Whitechapel, thousands crammed into rotting tenements, where sewage pooled in hallways and disease clung to every breath. The smell of refuse, coal smoke, and stagnant water mixed into a permanent fog that choked the senses. This environment was more than a backdrop, it was a co-conspirator. Street lighting struggled to penetrate the thick air, leaving alleyways as black as ink. Narrow courtyards twisted violently into dead ends known only by locals. Outsiders became lost within minutes. Residents learned to navigate by instinct, memory, and desperation. Some nights, the fog grew so dense that a person couldn't see their own hand extended in front of their face. These were perfect hunting conditions. A predator didn't need to vanish into the night. He only needed to take 2 steps backwards. Police forces were overwhelmed. Officers patrolled with whistles, not radios. Communication was limited to shouted warnings and handwritten notes. Criminals exploited this primitive infrastructure. If an officer turned a corner, he might lose sight of his partner instantly, swallowed by the gloom. Whitechapel's lodging houses added fuel to the fire. For a few coins, destitute women could rent a bed for the night. When they couldn't, they walked the streets, vulnerable, exhausted, and out of options. The killer didn't stalk the wealthy, he targeted the forgotten. Rumors began to swirl that the murderer had medical training, given the precision of the mutilations. Others believed he was familiar with slaughterhouses. Fireside debates erupted nightly, but no theory brought comfort. Fear changed the rhythm of the streets. Shopkeepers closed early, pub patrons drank faster, doors bolted sooner. Still, the murders continued, not because the killer was invisible, but because the environment hid him. Whitechapel was a maze designed accidentally, its architecture a shield for evil. Here, anonymity was effortless. Predators moved unnoticed. The desperate whispered warnings, but poverty drowned them out. And when the next victim fell, the city didn't ask why. It asked, who will be next? The legend of Jack the Ripper often overshadows the people at the center of his violence. But to understand the killer's method, one must examine the victim's history, now called the canonical 5. Each woman lived on the razor's edge of poverty, relying on lodging houses, alcohol to dull misery, and late-night streets to earn the few coins needed for shelter. Their vulnerability made them visible to a predator, searching for isolation, desperation, and silence. On August 31st, 1888, the first thread of the pattern was woven. Mary Ann Nichols was found lifeless in a dark gateway called Buck's Row. Her throat was cut so deeply, it suggested rage and rehearsal. There was little sound, little struggle. The killer vanished into corridors narrowing like throats. London trembled. Days later, on September 8th, parishioners discovered Annie Chapman behind a house on Hanbury Street. This murder was more brutal. She was mutilated with a speed and precision horrifying for its efficiency. The escalation had begun. Then came the night that still chills historians. On September 30th, 2 women were attacked within the same hour. Elizabeth Stride was discovered first. Her throat opened, but her body relatively untouched. Many believe the murderer was interrupted by a witness's approach, but interruption didn't cool his hunger. It redirected it. Less than 45 minutes later, in Mitre Square, he committed his most savage display on Catherine Eddowes. When police arrived, they recoiled. He had done to her what he'd been stopped from doing moments earlier, carving patterns of fury into her final, motionless canvas. The shawl found beside her would become a thread pulled across a century, and then silence. Until November 9th, Mary Jane Kelly was killed indoors, in a cramped room on Miller's Court. Here, the killer had privacy, warmth, and time. What he did inside those walls was so grotesque that officers refused to discuss details publicly. Hardened men turned pale. The city recoiled. After Kelly, Nothing. The murders ended abruptly, as if a string had snapped, but the pattern was undeniable. Escalating brutality, surgical efficiency, and an abrupt finale. History would spend the next century asking why the killings stopped. Science, however, may already know. As the murders mounted, Scotland Yard faced the largest criminal investigation in British history. Officers poured into Whitechapel, but their presence only highlighted how unprepared policing was for a methodical killer. Lacking radios, coordination depended on breathless runners and shouted instructions. Crime scene preservation was a foreign concept. Within minutes of discovery, crowds stampeded through bloodstains, smudging footprints and smearing clues. Reporters elbowed past constables, scribbling notes, while boots erased evidence. Even photographers struggled to arrive before chaos swallowed the scene. The press became the Ripper's greatest ally. Competing newspapers sensationalized every whisper, printing wild speculation simply to outsell rivals. Rather than supply clarity, they manufactured noise. Rumors spread like wildfire. The killer was a butcher, a surgeon, a foreigner, a member of the aristocracy. Anyone with a sharp tool became suspect. Anonymous letters flooded police offices, boasts, taunts, confessions. Most were fabrications, but one changed everything. The now infamous Dear Boss letter, signed with the chilling name Jack the Ripper. Though likely forged, its tone became the myth's foundation and birthed a persona that haunted London. The growing hysteria strained police resources. Officers worked exhausting shifts, patrolling alleyways so narrow 2 men could barely stand shoulder to shoulder. Every night, whistles pierced the fog as strangers were confronted simply for walking too quietly. Arrest records ballooned with petty crimes. Still, the killer outran them. Whitechapel's labyrinth of twisting streets seemed to contort at his approach, offering no witnesses and no mercy. One night, a fragment of a victim's apron was discovered under a dark archway, stained with blood. Above it, chalk graffiti blamed Jewish residents. Fear of riots forced the police commissioner to order the message wiped clean. An irreversible loss. It may have been the killer's only written clue, yet instead of tightening the investigation, the decision deepened confusion. Politicians demanded results. Citizens accused the police of incompetence. Officers snapped under pressure, often pointing suspicion anywhere but inward. And beneath the headlines, fear warped into fascination. Crowds toured murder sites. Postcard vendors sold morbid souvenirs. London's terror had become entertainment. In the end, hysteria drowned clarity. The killer never needed invisibility. London panicked on his behalf. More than a century after the final scream faded into London's fog, the Ripper case seemed destined to remain a historical riddle. Archivists debated suspects endlessly. Documentaries recycled familiar names, and amateur sleuths swore they held secret answers. But in 2014, something unexpected took root in the quiet corners of forensic science. The shawl, once dismissed as hearsay, was prepared for advanced analysis. Under ultraviolet light, the stains glowed like constellations, each one holding microscopic fragments of history. The lab's goal was simple: identify genetic signatures untouched by contamination. The team extracted mitochondrial DNA. Resilient fragments passed through maternal line. Matching these sequences required locating living descendants of potential suspects, an effort that sent researchers digging through genealogical records buried in dusty registers. When a match emerged from the female line of a notorious name, the scientific world paused. The genetic markers on the shawl aligned with descendants related to Aaron Kosminski, the very suspect Victorian detectives had whispered about in private. Suddenly, the coldest of cold cases warmed with possibility. The announcement ignited headlines worldwide. Ripper identified. Case closed. Some cheered, others scoffed. Historians raised their eyebrows. Critics argued that contamination over 137 years rendered certainty impossible. After all, countless hands had touched the fabric. Auction houses, collectors, curious onlookers, each could have left biological breadcrumbs. But the researchers insisted the tested cells came from protected layers, buried beneath decades of exposure, shielded from modern interference. They claimed the probability of coincidence was astronomical. Still, skeptics hammered back. They pointed out flaws in storage, ambiguity in record-keeping, and the lack of independent lab replication. Conspiracy forums erupted. Was the shawl authentic? Was Kosminski framed by bias against immigrants? Was the evidence convenient, a tidy bow atop a chaotic story? Meanwhile, descendants of other suspects watched from the sidelines, unwilling to surrender their ancestral mystery. Museums declined to issue definitive statements. Academics sparred across conferences. The Ripper's shadow stretched across yet another generation, because sometimes proof doesn't end discussion. It starts war. In the end, a single thread of silk did what London's police never could. It forced the world to confront a name lost in asylum walls. But clarity did not bring peace. It brought louder questions. When Aaron Kosminski was committed to an asylum in 1891, the murders stopped instantly. Doctors recorded delusions, violent episodes, and an obsessive hatred toward women. He spent decades in silence, eventually dying behind locked doors, reduced to a whisper in poorly kept files. Victorians didn't speak of him again, but today, DNA, testimony, and timing draw an almost perfect outline around his shadow. Yet even with science on the table, many refuse to accept closure. Mysteries live longer than answers. Souvenir hunters, tour guides, internet detectives, they all need the question mark. So is the case truly closed? Maybe, maybe not. What's undeniable is this. The terror haunting Whitechapel was not a prince, a surgeon, or a genius from the aristocratic elite. It was a local man slipping through alleys the police couldn't map. A face no one noticed until it was far too late. And somewhere, in a museum drawer or private collection, his final traces still cling to thread and dust. Subscribe for more chilling history.